Captain James Harlow's breath clouded before him as he studied the daily intelligence briefings. Outside the reinforced windows of Outpost Sentinel, darkness had settled 15 hours ago and wouldn't lift for another 9. January in Alaska, 170 miles north of the Arctic Circle, meant living in a perpetual state of night, broken only by the ghostly green shimmer of the aurora borealis and the harsh fluorescent lighting inside the station. "Anything interesting from our friends across the strait?" he asked, not looking up from the papers. Lieutenant Diane Foster shook her head, the movement making her dark ponytail sway slightly against her thermal uniform. "Same encrypted transmissions on the same frequencies. If the Soviets are planning anything, they're not discussing it over channels we're monitoring." Harlow nodded, unsurprised. With the Berlin Wall down and the Soviet Union crumbling, their mission felt increasingly anachronistic. While the world's attention focused on Desert Storm in the Middle East, 12 American military and scientific personnel remained frozen in a Cold War outpost the time seemed to have forgotten. "The team is getting restless," Foster added, her tone measured but concerned. "Dr. Reynolds is requesting another ice core extraction despite the temperature drop. Says she found something unusual in yesterday's samples." Harlow sighed. "Unusual how?" She wouldn't elaborate over the comm. "Insisted on showing you in person." The captain checked his watch. "Fine. I'll head to the lab after the 1400 systems check. Anything else?" Foster hesitated. Corporal Hayes reported some anomalous transmissions last night. Probably atmospheric interference, but he seemed unsettled. Something in her voice made Harlow look up. Foster wasn't one for exaggeration or unnecessary concern. For her to mention it meant something had genuinely disturbed the typically unflappable communications specialist. "I'll speak with him as well," Harlow said, dismissing her with a nod. The laboratory level sat 2 floors below the surface, carved directly into the permafrost. Dr. Abigail Reynolds, a glaciologist with more degrees than social skills, barely acknowledged Harlow's entrance, her attention fixed on a cylindrical ice core, glowing blue under specialized lighting. "You wanted to see me, Doctor?" Harlow prompted after several seconds of silence. Reynolds startled slightly, then gestured him closer. This core was extracted from 300 feet below us. "Notice anything unusual?" Harlow studied the translucent cylinder. Unlike the other samples stored in the lab's freezers, this one had a strange quality to it, almost as if something within the ice was emitting a faint luminescence. "It's glowing." "Bioluminescence," Reynolds corrected. "And that's not all. The core temperature is inconsistent with its depth. It's warming from within, Captain." Harlow frowned. "That's impossible." "That's what I said." Reynolds switched to a microscope display, revealing tiny organisms suspended in the melted sample. These microorganisms shouldn't exist at that depth or temperature. Their cellular structure is unlike anything in our taxonomic databases. Could they be contamination from the extraction process? Number, they're embedded throughout the sample. And they're active, metabolizing, reproducing, despite having been frozen for what preliminary dating suggests is approximately 15,000 years. Harlow studied the magnified image, unease settling over him. The organisms pulsed with an internal rhythm that seemed almost coordinated. "I'd like Dr. Nakamura to examine these," he said finally. "Keep this between the three of us for now. No need to alarm the others." Reynolds nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "There's something else. The ice surrounding this sample, it's structurally different. Almost as if it had been deliberately arranged." Corporal William Hayes had the haunted look of someone who hadn't slept. His workspace in the communications center was meticulously organized, in stark contrast to his disheveled appearance. "You reported anomalous transmissions," Harlow prompted. Hayes nodded, reaching for his headphones. "It started around 200 hours. At first, I thought it was cross-channel interference from one of the abandoned Soviet stations. But then..." He pressed a button and static filled the room, punctuated by what sounded like distorted speech. "Russian?" Harlow asked, straining to make sense of the garbled sounds. "That's what I thought initially. But listen." Hayes adjusted something, and the playback reversed. The backward speech became slightly more coherent, but in no language Harlow recognized. "Could be signal degradation," Harlow suggested, but without conviction. "Sir, I've monitored communications in the Arctic for 3 years. I've never heard distortion like this." Hayes lowered his voice, "And it's getting stronger. Each transmission comes through clearer than the last." Before Harlow could respond, Specialist Catherine Chen burst into the room, her usual composure visibly shaken. "Captain, you need to see this," she said without preamble. The meteorological station occupied the highest point of the outpost, a glass-enclosed dome offering a 360-degree view of the surrounding ice shelf. Chen led Harlow to her monitoring equipment, pointing to readings that meant nothing to him. "Explain," he ordered. "We're detecting atmospheric anomalies unlike anything in our records. Temperature inversions, electromagnetic fluctuations, and..." She pointed toward the horizon, where the aurora borealis danced with unusual intensity. Aurora patterns that defy known physics. Harlow watched the lights pulse and swirl, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their complexity. The anomalies began exactly when Corporal Hayes detected those transmissions, Chen added quietly, and they're centered directly above where Dr. Reynolds extracted that ice core. A chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic temperature ran down Harlow's spine. That night, as most of the outpost slept, Private First Class Jason Okafor jerked awake, heart pounding. The nightmare lingered, voices calling from deep below, speaking words he couldn't understand, but somehow recognized. Voices that promised secrets from the ice, if only he would listen. Disoriented, he switched on his lamp and froze. A hairline crack ran across his floor, a crack that hadn't been there when he'd fallen asleep. As he watched, frost formed along its edges, not spreading outward as it should, but emerging from within, as if something below was breathing cold air through the fracture. In the silence of his room, he could have sworn he heard it whisper his name. Meanwhile, in the laboratory, Dr. Nakamura stared in disbelief at the ice core sample. The microorganisms had multiplied exponentially in just hours, and the ice continued to warm. But most disturbing was what the advanced DNA sequencing had revealed. These weren't just unknown microorganisms. they weren't entirely biological at all. Outside, the aurora flared with impossible colors, and somewhere in the darkness beneath the outpost, something ancient shifted in its icy prison, awakening to the presence of those above. The cold had preserved it for millennia. The thaw had begun. The next 2 weeks at Outpost Sentinel saw the emergence of invisible divisions, fault lines running through the team as surely as they were beginning to appear in the ice beneath them. Captain Harlow observed the fracturing from his position of command, trying to maintain order while acknowledging the growing strangeness. "We need to inform headquarters," Lieutenant Foster insisted during their private briefing on January 18th. Outside, the perpetual Arctic night was broken only by floodlights illuminating swirling snow. These phenomena aren't isolated incidents anymore. Harlow rubbed his temples, feeling the beginnings of what had become a persistent headache. "And tell them what exactly?" "That we have unusual ice samples, strange radio transmissions. They'll tell us to run diagnostics and file reports." "With respect, sir, it's more than that now." Foster's expression remained composed, but tension showed in the set of her shoulders. Dr. Brooks recorded seismic activity yesterday that doesn't match any known pattern. "Geological events don't always follow established patterns, Lieutenant." "These do," came a voice from the doorway. Dr. Natalie Brooks stood there, tablet in hand, her normally neat appearance showing signs of strain. Dark circles underlined her eyes, and her hair had escaped its usual tidy bun. "They're rhythmic, Captain. Perfectly rhythmic. Like a heartbeat." Harlow gestured for her to enter, and Brooks placed her tablet on his desk, displaying seismic waveforms that pulsed with unmistakable regularity. "This isn't possible through any known geological process," Brooks continued. "I've compared it to volcanic activity, tectonic movement, even glacial shifts. Nothing matches." Foster leaned forward. "And the epicenter?" "Directly beneath us, 300 feet down." Brooks met Harlow's gaze. Exactly where Dr. Reynolds extracted that core sample. The mess hall had become a battleground of whispers. Sergeant Michael Wilson held court at one table, surrounded by those who attributed the strange occurrences to equipment malfunctions and the psychological effects of isolation. At another sat Reynolds and her faction, trading observations about the escalating anomalies. "All I'm saying," Wilson's voice carried across the room, "is that we've been stuck in this icebox for months. People start seeing patterns where there aren't any." Dr. Reynolds didn't look up from her notes. "Seismic waves don't generate themselves from psychological strain, Sergeant." "No, but people misread data when they're looking for excitement," Wilson countered. "When was the last time Brooks calibrated that equipment?" PFC Okafor sat alone, picking at his food, gaze distant. The dreams had continued nightly. Voices from the ice, calling to him in a language he shouldn't understand, but somehow did. The crack in his floor had sealed itself by morning, making him question his sanity until he began noticing similar fissures appearing throughout the outpost. Dr. Robert Nakamura slid into the seat across from him, voice low. "You haven't been sleeping." It wasn't a question. Okafor looked up, surprised by the microbiologist's attention. Nakamura rarely engaged with the military personnel beyond professional necessity. "Just dreams." Okafor muttered. Nakamura studied him with clinical intensity. What kind of dreams? Something in the scientist's tone made Okafor hesitate. Why? Because you're not the only one having them. Captain Harlow's request for additional supplies and personnel met predictable bureaucratic resistance. The Gulf War dominated military resources and attention. A remote listening post reporting unusual but non-threatening phenomena was low priority. We're on our own for now, he informed Foster after another frustrating satellite call with headquarters. They'll expedite the next scheduled supply drop by 3 days. That's the best they can do. Foster's expression tightened. That's not enough, sir. Not with what's happening. It's all we're getting. Harlow leaned back in his chair. How's team morale? Deteriorating. The division between Wilson's group and Reynolds's is growing. People are choosing sides. And you, Lieutenant? Which side are you on? Foster met his gaze steadily. I'm on the side of keeping this outpost functional and our people safe, sir. But I think dismissing these events as nothing more than cabin fever is dangerous. Before Harlow could respond, the intercom crackled to life. Specialist Garcia's voice tense. Captain Harlow to the medical bay. Immediately. His core temperature is 94.7 degrees. Garcia reported, gesturing to Corporal Martinez, who lay shivering on an examination table, despite being wrapped in thermal blankets. It dropped suddenly during a shift. No exposure to outside conditions, no prior symptoms. Martinez's lips had taken on a bluish tint, his dark skin ashen beneath its normal tone. I keep hearing them, he whispered when Harlow approached. In the walls, under the floor. Tapping. Like they're trying to send a message. Harlow exchanged glances with Garcia, who shook his head slightly. We found no physical cause for his condition. And he's not the only one reporting auditory hallucinations. Not hallucinations, Martinez insisted weakly. They're real. Getting closer. Technician Lucas Wright prided himself on understanding Outpost Sentinel's mechanical systems better than anyone. The heating system's recent behavior defied that understanding. Despite being set to maintain a constant temperature, sensors showed a 3-degree increase throughout the lower levels. Could be sensor malfunction, Wilson had suggested when Wright reported it. All of them simultaneously. Wright had countered. I need to check the maintenance tunnels. Something's not right. The tunnels ran beneath the primary structure, housing pipes and wiring protected from the extreme conditions above. Wright descended alone, armed with a flashlight and toolkit. The temperature rose noticeably as he moved deeper, humidity fogging his glasses. Halfway down the main tunnel, he stopped. The wall beside him glistened with moisture, impossible given the external temperature. He pressed his hand against it, jerking back at the unexpected warmth. Control, this is Wright. He spoke into his radio. Something's happening to the inner walls. They're warm to the touch and sweating. Static answered him. He tried again, adjusting frequencies. Nothing. Wright continued forward, unease building. 20 meters ahead, the tunnel took a sharp turn, beyond which lay the main heating distribution node. As he rounded the corner, his flashlight illuminated a sight that stopped him cold. The metal floor had buckled upward, revealing a fissure in the permafrost beneath. Steam rose from the opening, carrying a scent like stagnant seawater and something else, something organic and ancient. As Wright stared, transfixed, the crack widened slightly, ice groaning. His training reasserted itself. He needed to report this immediately. Wright turned to retreat, only to freeze as something moved within the fissure. Something fluid and glistening, reaching upward like a probing finger. The scream that echoed through the outpost's intercom system was cut short, replaced by static, and then silence. The rescue team found Wright standing motionless, staring at a blank section of wall. The fissure had sealed itself, leaving no evidence of what he'd reported. When Sergeant Wilson touched his shoulder, Wright didn't respond. His eyes, when they finally turned to the team, were frosted over with a thin layer of ice that didn't melt under the beam of their flashlights. "Lucas?" Wilson questioned, professional detachment failing to mask his shock. "Can you hear me?" Wright's lips parted, releasing a cloud of frozen breath despite the tunnel's unnatural warmth. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the rescue team's recording equipment distort. "They're waking up," he said, each word precise and emotionless. "The sleepers in the deep cold. They hear us now. They're coming through." As they carried his unresisting form to the medical bay, a sound like distant thunder reverberated through the outpost. On the monitoring equipment in Dr. Brooks's geology lab, seismic sensors registered movement, the ice beneath them shifting with deliberate purpose. The fault lines were spreading, not just through the ice, but through the minds of those who walked above it. February arrived with increasing darkness, not from the Arctic winter, which had already reached its nadir of perpetual night, but from the spreading anomalies throughout Outpost Sentinel. Lucas Wright's condition deteriorated in ways that defied medical explanation. It's as if his body is adapting to something, Dr. Nakamura explained to Captain Harlow in the quarantine section of the medical bay. Through the observation window, they watched Wright sitting motionless on his bed, staring at the wall. His core temperature has stabilized at 87 degrees, a level that should render a human comatose. Yet his cognitive functions remain intact. "Define intact," Harlow said, watching as Wright's lips moved in silent communion with something only he could perceive. "He's responsive, just not to us." Nakamura hesitated. "The language he's speaking, I've had Specialist Chen analyzing it. It appears to be a Proto-Inuit dialect that hasn't been spoken in thousands of years." Harlow turned sharply to the microbiologist. "How is that possible?" "Wright has no linguistic training. The same way it's possible for his body to function at a temperature that should kill him." Nakamura handed Harlow a tablet displaying microscopic images. "I found these organisms in his bloodstream. They match those from the ice core, but they've evolved rapidly. They're concentrating around his brainstem and nervous system." Harlow studied the images, a cold dread settling in his stomach. Are they controlling him? Perhaps, or changing him? Nakamura's voice dropped lower. "Captain, I believe we're dealing with a pathogen, one specifically adapted to alter human physiology." Inside the isolation room, Wright suddenly turned toward the observation window, his frosted eyes seeming to lock directly with Harlow's. His mouth opened, releasing a cloud of frozen breath as he spoke with perfect clarity. They've been sleeping in the cold darkness. Now they're awakening to reclaim what was taken. A smile spread across Wright's blue-tinged lips. They remember this world from before the ice, before the warming, before your kind. Power fluctuations plagued the outpost with increasing frequency. Equipment failed systematically. Communications first, followed by perimeter sensors and environmental controls. Technician Wright might have diagnosed the issues easily, but he remained in isolation, communing with voices only he could hear. Corporal David Martinez recovered from his earlier collapse, but still unnaturally pale, worked tirelessly on the electrical systems. It's like something is drawing power, he explained to Lieutenant Foster as they examined a junction box whose circuits had melted despite the surge protectors. But none of our monitors show where it's going. Foster frowned. Could it be rerouted somewhere off-grid? That would require extensive rewiring. We'd notice. Would we? Foster gestured to the darkened corridor around them. Emergency lighting cast everything in a red glow that made shadows seem deeper, more substantial. Half our systems are compromised, and we have no way to contact the mainland. A sound drew their attention. A soft tapping from inside the wall beside them. Martinez tensed, his earlier conviction about the noises resurfacing. "You hear that too?" he whispered. Foster nodded slowly, drawing her sidearm. The tapping increased in tempo, moving along the wall like something following their position. She approached cautiously, pressing her ear against the metal surface. The tapping stopped directly beneath her ear. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the corridor. Then, a sound like fingernails dragging across metal emanated from inside the wall, followed by a soft voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Listen." Foster jerked back, training her weapon on the wall. "Martinez, get Captain Harlow. Now." But Martinez stood frozen, head tilted as if straining to hear something. "They're trying to help us understand," he murmured, eyes unfocused. "They were here first. They're just coming home." Sleep became a battleground. Those still unaffected found themselves plagued by dreams of dark water and massive shapes moving beneath the ice. Patient, ancient creatures stirring from millennia of dormancy. The affected personnel didn't appear to sleep at all, working tirelessly on tasks they couldn't or wouldn't explain. Dr. Reynolds and Lieutenant Foster ventured outside the outpost to examine the surrounding ice shelf. Suited against the minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit temperature, they followed anomalous readings from ground-penetrating radar. There, Reynolds pointed to what appeared to be an ordinary snowdrift, the signal strongest here. They approached cautiously. Foster swept away loose snow with her gloved hand, revealing ice with a different quality than its surroundings, darker, almost translucent. "This isn't natural formation," Reynolds said, voice hushed despite their private comm channel. "The crystalline structure, it's too ordered." As their helmet lights played across the surface, patterns emerged. Geometric shapes and lines too precise to be geological accidents. They resembled architectural blueprints, or perhaps circuit diagrams etched into the ice itself. "How far do they extend?" Foster asked. Reynolds consulted her equipment. "Based on these readings, in every direction, for miles." She looked up, the revelation dawning in her eyes. It's not that we built our outpost over them. It's that they built under us, around us, through us. Foster's light caught something else. A dark shape suspended in the ice, several feet below the surface. Roughly cylindrical, with protrusions like atrophied limbs. Is that a body? Reynolds confirmed grimly, humanoid. But wrong somehow. Before they could investigate further, their comms crackled with Harlow's voice. Return to base immediately. We've got a situation. Specialist Samuel Garcia had been monitoring the affected personnel with increasing concern. Physical changes were becoming more evident. Slightly lower body temperatures, bluish tint to their skin, pupil dilation that didn't respond normally to light. Look at these blood samples, he told Harlow, displaying comparative analyses. The infected show increased hemoglobin efficiency. They're extracting more oxygen per breath. Their cellular metabolism has slowed, but neural activity has increased dramatically, particularly in regions associated with long-term memory. Memory of what? Harlow asked. These organisms have been frozen for thousands of years. Maybe not the organisms themselves, Dr. Nakamura interjected. But what if they're carriers? Vectors for information stored in their unique DNA structure. Garcia nodded. Like a biological hard drive, preserving the memories of whatever they originally belonged to. A commotion outside interrupted them. They emerged from the lab to find Corporal Hayes grappling with Specialist Chen, whose strength seemed to have multiplied exponentially. She had him pinned against the wall, fingers pressing into his throat with inhuman force. They're coming through the static, she hissed. Her pupils expanded until her eyes appeared black. Why can't you hear them? They're so loud now. Harlow and Garcia managed to pull her away, but not before Hayes collapsed, gasping for air, red marks blossoming on his neck. Restrain her, Harlow ordered. Medical isolation, like right. As they dragged the struggling meteorologist away, Hayes looked up at Harlow with genuine fear. Captain, there's something you need to hear. His voice was raspy from the assault. I've been monitoring those transmissions. They're not coming from any Soviet station. They're being broadcast from directly beneath us. Captain Harlow instituted stricter protocols, buddy systems, regular medical checks, limited access to critical systems. But as February wore on, these measures proved increasingly ineffective. The infection, whatever it was, spread rapidly through water, air, perhaps even touch. In his private quarters, Harlow recorded his observations in a personal log, knowing it might be the only record to survive if, when, things deteriorated further. The entities beneath us appear to be using the infected personnel as proxies. He spoke quietly into his recorder. I believe our presence, our electromagnetic emissions, our deep drilling, perhaps even our body heat, triggered some kind of awakening protocol. We're dealing with something that predates human civilization, possibly even human evolution. He paused, rubbing his eyes. Sleep had become precious and rare, the dreams too disturbing to endure for long. Lieutenant Foster remains unaffected, as do Sergeant Wilson, Dr. Nakamura, Specialist Garcia, and PFC Okafor. Dr. Reynolds shows early symptoms, but remains lucid. The others, he sighed heavily, They're changing in ways we don't understand, working towards some purpose we can't fathom. A noise from outside his door made him reach for his sidearm. Footsteps passed, then stopped. Something scratched against the metal, like a message being carved. When the footsteps retreated, Harlow cautiously opened the door. Etched into the metal with impossible precision were symbols. The same symbols Dr. Reynolds had discovered in the ice. The same symbols that appeared in Wright's feverish drawings. As Harlow stared, frost formed around the markings, spreading outward in crystalline patterns, too deliberate to be random. The thaw was accelerating, and with it, the awakening of something that had waited patiently through ages of ice for its time to return. By mid-February, Outpost Sentinel no longer functioned as a military installation, but as a grotesque parody of one. Half the team now exhibited symptoms similar to Wright's: lowered body temperature, blue-tinged skin, and a distant look in their frosted eyes. They moved through the station with deliberate purpose, modifying equipment and accessing restricted areas, while ignoring orders from Captain Harlow. "We need to establish secure communications with the mainland," Harlow told the dwindling group of unaffected personnel gathered in his office. "Whatever's happening here can't be allowed to spread." "The satellite uplink has been sabotaged," Sergeant Wilson reported grimly, completely gutted. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Dr. Nakamura nodded. "They're working collectively now. I've been observing their behavior patterns. They move like a single organism with distributed parts." Lieutenant Foster studied the station schematics displayed on Harlow's tablet. "We still have the emergency transmitter in the communications bunker. It's isolated from the main systems." "What about evacuation?" PFC Okafor asked, the youngest among them looking increasingly haunted. The dreams had intensified. Each night he heard more voices, understood more of their ancient language. "In this weather," Wilson gestured toward the observation window, where a massive storm had reduced visibility to zero. Winds howled at 70 miles per hour, driving temperatures down to -70 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. "We'd freeze before making it a mile." Harlow's expression hardened. "We're not leaving. Not until we understand what we're dealing with and how to stop it." "The water supply," Garcia interjected. "That's how it's spreading so quickly. The microorganisms have contaminated the entire system." "Can we filter them out?" Foster asked. Garcia shook his head. "They're smaller than our finest filters, and they adapt rapidly to environmental changes. I've been running tests on samples from different affected personnel. The organisms are evolving unique properties based on the host body chemistry." A heavy silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. "So what's the plan, Captain?" Wilson finally asked. Before Harlow could answer, the outpost's emergency klaxon blared to life. Red warning lights bathed the room as the automated system announced, "Perimeter breach detected. Multiple points of structural compromise. All personnel initiate emergency protocol Omega." The security monitors showed chaos unfolding throughout the outpost. In the lower levels, the infected personnel had removed wall panels and floor plates, exposing the permafrost foundation. Steam rose from widening fissures as they worked with tools never designed for excavation. "What the hell are they doing?" Wilson muttered, cycling through camera feeds. Creating access points, Foster said, realization dawning in her eyes, to the chambers below. Harlow keyed his radio. All unaffected personnel, fall back to the upper-level command center immediately. Bring whatever weapons and supplies you can carry. As the group moved to comply, Dr. Reynolds appeared in the doorway. She'd been missing for hours, and the changes were immediately apparent. Her skin had taken on the characteristic bluish tint, but her eyes remained clear, fighting whatever influence had claimed the others. "Captain," she gasped, struggling visibly to form words. "The radar. You need to see. What's under us?" Harlow approached cautiously, weapon ready but not raised. "Dr. Reynolds, are you with us?" She nodded jerkily, like someone fighting against invisible restraints. "For now. But they're in my head. So many voices. So old." She thrust a tablet toward him. "Look, please." The display showed ground-penetrating radar images of the area beneath the outpost. What they had assumed were geological formations were revealed as massive organic structures, hibernating entities preserved in the ice for millennia. The scale was difficult to comprehend. Some of the shapes extended hundreds of feet through the permafrost. "My God," Foster whispered. Looking over Harlow's shoulder, "How many are there?" "Dozens," Reynolds managed, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cold. "Maybe hundreds. A colony, preserved in stasis until..." She doubled over suddenly, a spasm running through her body. "Until we woke them with our heat, our electricity, our sound. Dr. Reynolds?" Harlow reached for her, but she jerked away. "Don't touch me." Her voice had changed, harmonics shifting to something inhuman. The infection spreads through contact now. They're adapting. She straightened slowly, and when she looked up, the battle in her eyes was clearly being lost. "You need to destroy this place. All of it. Before they fully awaken." A violent tremor ran through the outpost, knocking equipment from shelves and sending fine cracks racing across the ceiling. On the security monitors, they watched as sections of the lower levels collapsed into newly formed chasms. "Too late," Reynolds whispered, her expression shifting to something alien and triumphant. "They're coming through." Specialist Chen's transformation was the first to complete. Security cameras captured her body contorting in the isolation room, bones cracking as her frame elongated. Her skin hardened into chitin-like plates, fingers extending into tapered appendages. When the process finished, what remained only vaguely resembled the woman who had monitored weather patterns just weeks earlier. The creature shattered the reinforced observation window with a casual swipe, sensors registering the impossible strength behind the blow. It moved with unsettling grace through the medical bay, head tilted as if listening to directions only it could hear. Jesus Christ, Wilson breathed as they watched the feed from the command center. What did she become? Not what, Nakamura corrected grimly. Who? These aren't random mutations. They're deliberate transformations. The microorganisms are rewriting human DNA to recreate something specific. On screen, the transformed Chen encountered two security personnel who raised weapons. It moved with blinding speed, disarming them with precise strikes before touching each man's face with elongated fingers. They collapsed immediately, bodies already beginning to show the telltale signs of infection. They've weaponized it, Garcia realized. Direct neural transfer through contact. Harlow made his decision. Sergeant Wilson, Lieutenant Foster, secure the armory. We need every weapon we can get. Nakamura, Garcia, gather whatever research might help us understand these things. Okafor, with me. We're heading to the communications bunker. As the team dispersed, Reynolds staggered toward the door. Captain, she called, her voice oscillating between human and other. When you see what emerges from below, don't look directly at it. The human mind can't process their true form. It breaks something inside you that can't be fixed. Before Harlow could question her further, she fled down the corridor, movements already becoming less human with each step. PFC Okafor followed Captain Harlow through maintenance passages that bypassed the most heavily compromised sections of the outpost. The emergency lighting cast everything in blood-red hues, transforming familiar surroundings into an alien landscape. Sir, Okafor ventured hesitantly, I think I understand some of what they're saying. Harlow glanced at him sharply. The infected? Number the voices, in the dreams. Okafor swallowed hard. They talk about a cycle, a great thawing and freezing. They've been through this before, hibernating during ice ages, emerging during warming periods. They see humans as an infestation, something that flourished during their last hibernation. And now they want to reclaim their world, Harlow concluded. Okafor nodded miserably. They're not just waking up, sir. They're calling others from all across the Arctic. That's what the signals are. A beacon. They reached the communications bunker, a reinforced room designed to maintain contact in worst-case scenarios. Harlow quickly powered up the emergency transmitter. But before he could begin broadcasting, the worst-case scenario arrived. An inhuman screech echoed through the ventilation system. The metal walls around them bulged inward as something massive pressed against them from the maintenance tunnels. The temperature plunged suddenly, frost forming on every surface as the emergency lights. Barricaded in the communications center, the remaining uninfected personnel took stock of their dwindling resources. Sergeant Wilson and Lieutenant Foster had secured weapons from the armory, standard-issue sidearms, 2 shotguns, and a case of experimental thermite charges designed for Arctic warfare. Dr. Nakamura and Specialist Garcia had salvaged research materials and medical supplies. Captain Harlow and PFC Okafor had successfully transmitted a partial distress signal before being forced to retreat from the advancing transformed right. How much of the message got through? Foster asked, helping Harlow reinforce the door with equipment racks. Enough to raise alarms, not enough for them to understand what they're dealing with, Harlow replied grimly, if they received it at all. The communications center offered temporary sanctuary. Built to withstand extreme conditions, its walls were reinforced with layers of insulation and metal plating. But as the transformations spread throughout the outpost, even this stronghold would eventually fall. Lieutenant Foster sat at the main console, fingers flying over the keyboard. Despite showing early signs of infection, a slight blue tinge to her skin, a persistent chill she couldn't shake, she fought against the influence with remarkable resilience. I'm accessing the secure server, she announced. There might be something in the classified archives that could help us understand what we're facing? Dr. Nakamura joined her, his scientific curiosity undimmed despite their dire circumstances. What are you looking for specifically? Precedent, Foster replied. We can't be the first to encounter these entities. As the system slowly responded to her access codes, the sounds of transformation echoed through the outpost. Metal twisted, concrete cracked, and inhuman voices called to each other in that ancient language that seemed increasingly familiar to those still fighting the infection. Here, Foster said suddenly, pointing to an encrypted file buried deep in the system. Soviet Signal Anomaly, 1961. Classified ultraviolet. Harlow frowned. That's above my clearance level. I don't think protocol matters much at this point, sir, Foster said, her voice betraying the strain of her internal battle. With a few keystrokes, she bypassed the security measures, revealing documents and images that had been hidden for decades. The files detailed a Soviet expedition to an ice station not far from their current position. Like Outpost Sentinel, it had been established to monitor American activities across the strait. Like them, the Soviets had drilled deep into the permafrost. And like them, they had awakened something ancient and hostile. The Soviets encountered the same entities, Nakamura translated from the Russian text. They described transformations identical to what we're witnessing: lowered body temperature, physical mutations, collective consciousness. Photographs showed Soviet personnel in various stages of transformation, their bodies elongated, skin hardened into chitin-like plates, eyes frosted over. Final images revealed the ice station devastated. Massive holes torn through its foundation into the chambers below. What happened to them? Garcia asked, the medical specialist growing paler as he studied the horrific transformations. Foster scrolled through the documents. According to this, the Soviets lost contact with the station after 2 weeks of increasingly disturbing transmissions. They dispatched a team to investigate, but found nothing. The entire station and everyone in it had vanished. Not vanished, Harlow corrected, pointing to satellite imagery appended to the file. Look at the date stamp on these photos. The images, taken 3 days after the final transmission from the Soviet station, showed an unusual thermal signature, a perfect circle of intense heat where the station had stood. They nuked it, Wilson realized, classified as a test to the outside world. A limited tactical nuclear strike, Harlow confirmed. They understood the threat well enough to take extreme measures. Nakamura studied the radiation readings from the aftermath. The detonation temporarily drove the entities deeper, but didn't destroy them. Foster finished, just delayed their emergence. As this revelation sank in, a violent tremor shook the communications center. Dust rained from the ceiling as the reinforced walls groaned under sudden pressure. They're trying to break through, Wilson warned, readying his weapon. P.F.C. Okafor, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly grabbed Harlow's arm. Sir, I think I know how to fight them. His eyes were bright with fever, the early stages of infection evident, but his mind remained his own. The Soviet files. They mention extreme heat as the only effective weapon against the transformed personnel. That's why they resorted to a nuclear option. Nakamura agreed, understanding dawning. These entities evolved in deep ice, Their biochemistry is adapted to extreme cold. Sufficient heat disrupts their cellular structure. Harlow's gaze fell on the case of thermite charges. That's why these were developed. Someone in our chain of command knew. They've been preparing contingencies. Another tremor, stronger than the first, rocked the center. A crack appeared in the ceiling, frost immediately forming along its edges. "Captain," Foster called urgently. "There's more." The Soviets found something in the ice before everything went wrong. Some kind of artifact. The monitor displayed a grainy image of an object unlike anything they'd seen. A crystalline structure that seemed to shift and change even in the static photograph, its geometry defying normal physical laws. "They called it the beacon," she translated. "They believed it was some kind of communication device, transmitting signals across vast distances. A distress beacon," Nakamura realized, calling others of their kind from across the Arctic. "That's what the transformed personnel are doing," Harlow said. "Not just creating access points for those beneath us, but activating similar beacons at other locations." Another tremor, and the crack in the ceiling widened. Ice-cold air hissed through the opening as something pressed against the other side. "We need a plan," Wilson said, positioning himself beneath the breach, weapon raised. Harlow made his decision. The emergency fuel reserves in the lower-level storage bay. Combined with these thermite charges, we could create an explosion hot enough to collapse the entire structure into the chasm they've excavated below us. "Bury them again," Foster nodded. "But sir, that's suicide." "We're already dead if we do nothing," Harlow replied. "And if these things spread beyond this outpost..." He left the thought unfinished. The implications clear to everyone. Garcia, who had been monitoring their vital signs, spoke up. "Lieutenant Foster and I are showing advanced stages of infection. We have hours, maybe less, before we lose control." Foster's hands trembled slightly, but her eyes remained determined. "All the more reason to act quickly. I can still finish repairing the satellite uplink. Get a complete warning to headquarters while you prepare the charges." The ceiling cracked further, and a crystalline appendage pushed through. Similar to a human arm, but longer, jointed in impossible ways, ending in tapered fingers that searched blindly for something to grasp. "Time's up," Wilson announced, firing at the probing limb. It withdrew momentarily, blue fluid dripping from the wound and freezing instantly on the floor. "Foster, stay here and finish the transmission," Harlow ordered. "Wilson, Nakamura, Garcia, we're heading to the storage bay. Okafor, guard the lieutenant." As they prepared to move out, the young private spoke up. "Sir, I should go with you. I'm already infected too." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing the characteristic blue tinge spreading up his arm. "And I'm the only one who understands their language now. I might be able to predict their movements." Harlow studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Foster, will you be all right alone?" The lieutenant managed a grim smile, the blue tinge around her lips more pronounced. "I'll finish the job, sir. Someone has to warn them about what's coming." As the team prepared to leave their temporary sanctuary, Dr. Nakamura examined the Soviet files one last time, his expression troubled "Captain, there's something else here. The final transmission from the Soviet commander." He translated slowly, the words chilling them despite the growing cold. "Do not look directly at what emerges from below. Their true form exists partly in dimensions we cannot perceive. To see them fully is to invite madness." With those words echoing in their minds, they opened the reinforced door and stepped into the transformed nightmare that had once been Outpost Sentinel. Lieutenant Foster's fingers grew numb as she worked, the infection spreading through her system with increasing speed. The satellite uplink components blurred before her eyes, but she forced herself to focus. Behind her, the breach in the ceiling had widened, frost spreading across the communications center like a living thing. She knew she had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the transformed personnel broke through completely, or before her own transformation progressed beyond her control. With a final effort, she connected the last circuit and initiated the transmission sequence. "This is Lieutenant Diane Foster at Outpost Sentinel." She spoke into the microphone, fighting to keep her voice steady as ice crystals formed at the corners of her mouth. "We are compromised by an unknown biological agent of non-terrestrial origin. Ancient entities are awakening beneath the Arctic ice. They spread through infection and transform human hosts." She transmitted the Soviet files, along with their own research data and security footage showing the transformations. As the upload bar crawled toward completion, Foster felt the change accelerating within her. A cold clarity spreading through her mind, ancient memories not her own surfacing, like bubbles in thawing ice. "Extreme heat is their only vulnerability," she continued, words coming with greater difficulty. "The infection spreads through water, air, and contact. Quarantine protocols must be absolute." The ceiling gave way with a thunderous crack. Foster didn't turn to look. She kept her eyes fixed on the upload indicator. 98%. 99%. "They're calling others," she managed, her final human words. "All across the Arctic. They remember this world from before us, and they're coming to reclaim." Cold hands gripped her shoulders, turning her away from the console. Foster looked up into Dr. Reynolds's transformed face, no longer recognizable as human except for the eyes, which held a flicker of horrified awareness trapped within the alien consciousness that had claimed her. As the upload completed with a soft chime, Foster felt her own humanity slipping away like meltwater through cupped hands. The cold was no longer painful. It felt like returning home. Captain Harlow led his dwindling team through the nightmare that Outpost Sentinel had become. The familiar corridors had transformed into an alien landscape. Walls bulged with growths resembling coral formations made of ice. The floor rippled beneath their boots. Once solid concrete, now flexible and responsive, like living tissue. "What the hell is happening to the structure?" Wilson muttered. Shotgun trained on a pulsating growth that blocked half the corridor. "They're not just awakening," Dr. Nakamura replied, voice hushed with horrified fascination. "They're terraforming, transforming our environment to suit their biology, just as they're transforming our personnel." Okafor moved with increasing confidence despite his advancing infection, head tilted as if listening to distant voices. "This way," he said, leading them down a maintenance passage that bypass the worst of the transformations. They're concentrated in the lower levels, expanding upward. The storage bay that housed the emergency fuel reserves lay 2 levels below their current position. With the main stairwells compromised, they were forced to descend through service shafts designed for equipment transport. Halfway down, Specialist Garcia stumbled, dropping to one knee with a stifled groan. The others turned to find him clutching his chest, breath coming in frozen clouds despite the relative warmth of the shaft. "I can't," he gasped, the blue tinge on his skin darkening visibly. "It's happening too fast." Nakamura knelt beside him, checking his vital signs with professional detachment, despite the personal horror. His core temperature has dropped below 85 degrees. His cellular structure is changing rapidly. Garcia looked up at Harlow, fear and determination warring in his increasingly frosted eyes. "Leave me. Complete the mission." "We don't leave our people," Harlow insisted. "I'm not your people anymore," Garcia said with terrible clarity. "Not for much longer." He pressed his medical kit into Nakamura's hands. The stimulants might slow the transformation temporarily. Enough to finish what you started. Before they could argue further, a sound echoed up the shaft from below. A wet, sliding noise accompanied by the crack of transforming materials. Something was climbing toward them. "Go," Garcia urged, drawing his sidearm. "I'll buy you time." With grim resignation, Harlow clasped Garcia's shoulder. "We'll make it count, Sam." The remaining 4 continued their descent, Garcia's first shots echoing behind them, followed by an inhuman screech that reverberated through the metal shaft. Then silence. The storage bay was unrecognizable. What had once been an organized space of shelving units and supply crates had become a cathedral of ice and altered matter. The ceiling had partially collapsed, revealing a vast chamber beyond, a space that couldn't possibly exist within the outpost's original structure. Through the breach above, they glimpsed massive shapes moving with deliberate purpose, too large and too strange to fully comprehend. Looking at them directly caused immediate vertigo and disorientation, as if the human mind rejected what the eyes perceived. "Don't look up," Harlow ordered, remembering the Soviet commander's warning. "Focus on the mission." The emergency fuel reserves were stored in a reinforced container designed to withstand extreme conditions. It remained intact, though frost covered its surface and the keypad that secured it. "Sergeant, get that container open," Harlow directed. "Nakamura, Okafor, secure the perimeter. We don't know how many transformed personnel are still active." As Wilson worked on the container, Nakamura administered the stimulants Garcia had provided. The drugs temporarily counteracted the advancing infection, clearing their minds and steadying their hands. Even with all this fuel and the thermite charges, we'll need a catalyst to generate enough heat, Nakamura observed. Something to direct and intensify the explosion downward into their chamber. "The geothermal tap," Okafor suggested, the knowledge coming from somewhere beyond his training. "It extends directly into the magma pocket 3 miles below. If we can breach the containment seals..." The thought hung unfinished as a figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the storage bay. Dr. Reynolds, or what she had become, approached with the fluid grace of a predator. Her transformation had progressed further than any they had witnessed. body elongated to nearly 8 feet, limbs jointed in impossible ways, skin hardened into translucent plates that refracted light like living ice. "Captain James Harlow," she spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that made their recording equipment emit painful feedback. "You fight against inevitability." Harlow raised his weapon, but found himself unable to fire at what had once been a respected colleague. "What do you want, Reynolds?" "Abigail Reynolds no longer exists as you knew her. I speak with the collective voice of those who ruled when your kind huddled in caves." The creature moved closer, frost spreading from its feet with each step. "We arrived during your planet's ice age, established colonies across the polar regions. We adapted, evolved, created. Then the warming came, and your kind emerged from the southern lands. So you retreated," Nakamura realized, "went into hibernation. We preserved ourselves, waiting for the cycle to turn again." The thing that had been Reynolds gestured upward toward the massive chamber and the entities moving within it. "Your kind's activities, your burning of carbon, your warming of the atmosphere, accelerated our awakening. But it was your presence here, directly above us, that served as the final trigger." "The electromagnetic emissions," Harlow said, "the drilling, the heat signatures." "An alarm clock," the creature confirmed with what might have been amusement. "And now we return to a world that has forgotten us. A world that belongs to us by right of prior claim." Wilson had quietly finished opening the fuel container while the entity was distracted with conversation. He nodded slightly to Harlow, who kept the creature's attention. "And humanity. What place do we have in your world?" The transformed Reynolds tilted her head at an impossible angle. "Those who can be remade will join our collective consciousness. Those who cannot will not survive the changes to come." "Changes," Nakamura pressed, scientific curiosity momentarily overriding fear. "The atmosphere will cool. The ice will return. The world will become as it was during our golden age." The creature's mouth split in a horizontal smile, revealing crystalline teeth. "Already, our kindred awaken across the Arctic Circle. The beacons call them from their long sleep." With sudden, blurring speed, the entity lunged forward, seizing Sergeant Wilson by the throat before he could raise his weapon. "Enough delay. You cannot stop what has already begun." Wilson's shotgun discharged, the blast tearing through the creature's midsection. Blue fluid sprayed across the storage bay, freezing instantly on contact with the air. The creature recoiled, its wound already beginning to close as the tissue regenerated. "The fuel!" Harlow shouted. "Now!" Okafor and Nakamura moved to distribute the fuel canisters, while Harlow provided covering fire. The transformed Reynolds advanced again, shrugging off bullets with minimal effect. Wilson, bleeding from deep gouges in his neck, swung the empty shotgun like a club, buying precious seconds. "The geothermal tap," Okafor called, pointing to a sealed hatch in the floor. "It's our only chance." The entity seemed to recognize their plan. It let out a piercing cry that shook the very structure of the outpost, calling for reinforcements. From the shadows, transformed personnel began to emerge. Chen, Martinez, Hayes, all changed beyond recognition, moving with the coordinated purpose of a single organism. Wilson met Harlow's eyes, understanding passing between them. "Get to the tap," the sergeant said, positioning himself between the approaching transformed and the others. "I'll hold them here." "Michael," Harlow began. "Not a discussion, Captain." Wilson cut him off, reloading a shotgun with his last shells. "Someone has to make sure those charges detonate. Get Nakamura and the kid to the emergency bunker afterward. They deserve a chance." Before Harlow could respond, the transformed personnel attacked. Wilson met them with disciplined fire, each blast momentarily slowing their advance, but failing to stop them permanently. "Go!" he roared as the transformed Reynolds closed on him from behind. With a final nod to his security chief, Harlow led Nakamura and Okafor toward the geothermal tap. Wilson's last stand echoing behind them. The descent into humanity's final defense against an ancient horror had begun. Captain James Harlow had always expected to die in service. 22 years in the military had prepared him for that possibility. What he hadn't anticipated was making a last stand against an ancient, non-human intelligence in a remote Arctic outpost, armed with thermite charges and a desperate plan. The geothermal tap access required command-level authorization. As Harlow entered his codes, Nakamura and Okafor positioned the fuel canisters around the sealed hatch. Behind them, Wilson's shotgun blasts grew less frequent, then stopped altogether. The transformed personnel would be upon them soon. "The charges are set," Okafor reported, his voice steady despite the blue tinge now spreading visibly up his neck. The infection progressed more rapidly in some than others. The young private was fighting it with remarkable resilience. The access hatch opened with a pneumatic hiss, revealing the monitoring station for Outpost Sentinel's experimental geothermal tap. Designed to test the viability of drawing heat from the Earth's core in Arctic conditions, the tap extended 3 miles down through the permafrost, terminating in a magma pocket that maintained a constant temperature of over 1,000 degrees Celsius. "If we breach the containment seals," Nakamura explained, examining the control systems, "the pressure differential will force superheated material upward through the shaft. Combined with the fuel and thermite, it'll collapse the entire outpost into their chamber," Harlow finished. "How long do we need?" "The breach sequence has a 5-minute delay, a safety measure to allow evacuation. Someone needs to remain to ensure it completes." Nakamura met Harlow's gaze. "I'll do it." "No," Harlow shook his head. "Get Okafor to the emergency bunker. It's 2 miles east of the main structure, built to withstand extreme conditions. You might survive there until help arrives." "With respect, Captain," Nakamura countered, "I'm better qualified to ensure this system functions correctly, and..." He pulled back his sleeve, revealing the advanced blue discoloration. "I'm already too far gone. The stimulants are wearing off." Before Harlow could argue further, inhuman shrieks echoed from the storage bay. The transformed personnel had overcome Wilson and were advancing toward them. "Go," Nakamura urged. "I'll make sure this ends here." Harlow clasped the scientist's shoulder, no words adequate for the moment. Then he turned to Okafor. "Let's move." As they retreated through a maintenance tunnel that led toward the surface, Harlow glanced back to see Nakamura already at work, frost forming on his fingers as he typed commands into the geothermal tap's control system. The maintenance tunnel narrowed as it ascended, forcing them to crawl through sections where the outpost's transformation had warped the original structure. Ice formations resembling organ tissue pulsed with bioluminescent light, casting eerie blue shadows. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with slow, deliberate rhythm. "They're aware of us," Okafor whispered, translating knowledge that came from the infection spreading through his system. "The entire structure is an extension of them now, like a nervous system." As if confirming his words, the tunnel constricted behind them, cutting off their retreat. Ahead, the passage split into 3 branches. "Which way?" Harlow asked. Okafor tilted his head, listening to voices only he could hear. "Left." They're concentrated in the central shaft. They had progressed another 50 meters when Okafor suddenly stumbled, falling to his knees with a gasp of pain. "I can't," he choked, clutching his chest. The blue discoloration had spread across his face, his eyes beginning to frost over. "They're in my head, Captain." So many voices. So old. Harlow knelt beside him. "Fight it, soldier. Just a little longer." "They're showing me things. Their world before the ice. Their plans for what comes after." Okafor looked up, terror and wonder mingling in his increasingly inhuman gaze. "They're not just awakening here. All across the Arctic, others are stirring. This is just the first breach point." A violent tremor shook the tunnel, loosening ice from the ceiling. The geothermal tap breach sequence had begun. "We need to move," Harlow urged, helping Okafor to his feet. 4 minutes until detonation. They continued their ascent, Okafor weakening with each step as the infection accelerated. When they reached a junction that would lead them to the surface, the young private stopped. "I can't go any further," he said with strange calm, "but you can still make it to the emergency bunker." "I'm not leaving you behind," Harlow insisted. "You have to." Okafor's eyes cleared momentarily, the real person emerging from beneath the spreading alien influence. Someone has to warn them about what's coming, about the other awakening sites. Another tremor, stronger than the first, rocked the tunnel. The transformed tissue of the walls pulsed with increasing agitation. "They know what Nakamura is doing," Okafor said, head tilted as if listening. "They're trying to stop him." "Go, sir, please." With grim resolve, Harlow handed Okafor his sidearm. 2 miles east. Follow the perimeter markers. The young private nodded, then turned back toward the heart of the outpost. "I'll buy you time. Make it count, Captain." Harlow continued alone, the final ascent to the surface a blur of exertion and determined focus. Behind him, Okafor's gunshots echoed through the transformed outpost, followed by inhuman shrieks of rage. The Arctic night greeted Harlow with brutal cold and howling wind as he emerged from the maintenance exit. The blizzard continued unabated, visibility reduced to mere feet, despite the emergency flare he ignited. Through the swirling snow, the outpost's exterior revealed the extent of its transformation. The once angular military structure now resembled a grotesque, organic growth erupting from the ice shelf. As Harlow oriented himself toward the emergency bunker, a sound like tearing metal rose from beneath the ice, followed by a deep rumbling that he felt in his bones more than heard. The geothermal tap's containment seals had been breached. He ran, each step a battle against exhaustion, and the punishing conditions. Behind him, the rumbling intensified. Through breaks in the storm, he glimpsed massive shapes moving within the transformed outpost. Entities too large and too alien for the human mind to fully comprehend, their geometries shifting between dimensions as they sensed the impending destruction. The emergency bunker appeared through the white haze, a low dome-shaped structure, half buried in snow. Harlow had just reached its reinforced door when the world behind him erupted in apocalyptic fury. The thermite charges detonated in sequence, igniting the fuel reserves. This chain reaction coincided with the geothermal breach, sending superheated magma surging upward through the tap. The explosion that followed ignited methane pockets trapped in the permafrost, creating a cataclysmic cascade that tore through the ice shelf. Harlow was thrown forward by the shockwave, consciousness fading as the bunker door slammed shut behind him. His last sight was of Outpost Sentinel collapsing inward, the transformed structure and everything within it plunging into the chasm that opened beneath fire and ice waging their ancient battle once more. 3 weeks later, a search and rescue team reached the coordinates of Outpost Sentinel, dispatched in response to Lieutenant Foster's fragmentary transmission. They found nothing but a massive crater filled with refreezing water. The only evidence recovered was a sealed sample container with Dr. Nakamura's final report and a warning scrawled in frosted letters. Abandon all operations in the region. They are still below, still waiting. In a classified meeting room in Washington, military officials reviewed thermal satellite imagery, showing unusual melt patterns at 12 other locations across the Arctic Circle, each corresponding to abandoned Cold War listening posts. The patterns were expanding despite the season, defying natural explanations. "How did we miss this?" demanded a general, studying the images with growing alarm. "We didn't," replied a gray-haired scientist whose clearance predated the Cold War. "The Soviets encountered them first in '61. We found similar evidence in '78. Each time, we managed containment, but never elimination." "And Foster's transmission? How seriously should we take these claims?" The scientist's expression remained grave. The biological samples recovered from the site matched nothing in our taxonomic databases. The cellular structure suggests adaptation to extreme cold and pressure, conditions that haven't existed on Earth's surface for millennia. Recommendations: quarantine the entire region. No civilian or military presence within 200 miles of any identified site. And, the scientist hesitated, acceleration of the sun thaw, countermeasures. As the officials debated next steps 3,000 miles away, Private First Class Jason Okafor sat in medical isolation. The only survivor evacuated from a hunting cabin 40 miles from the Outpost Sentinel site. He appeared to have no memory of the incident or how he had reached the cabin. "I don't remember anything after January 10th, he repeated to his debriefers, expression blank, skin unnaturally pale despite weeks of treatment. "What happened to my team?" The medical officer noted with concern the unusual blue discoloration beginning at the base of Okafor's neck, a discoloration that spread a millimeter further each day, despite their best efforts to treat it. "We're still investigating," the officer replied carefully. "Try to rest." Later that night, as Arctic temperatures were reported to be the highest on record, for March 1991. Okafor stood alone by his window. His breath frosted the glass as he traced strange symbols with his finger. Symbols identical to those found etched in ice samples recovered from the crater. "They're still coming through," he whispered, eyes reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural blue glow. "The ice remembers. The ice preserves. The ice will reclaim." Beneath the frozen surface of the Arctic, ancient entities stirred from millennia of slumber. The brief conflagration at Outpost Sentinel had been merely a setback, a momentary delay in a process that had begun long before humanity's rise and would continue long after. The permafrost was thawing, and what it contained had waited patiently for its time to return.